Welcome to Dr. Lottie's Science with Soul, the podcast that transcends the boundaries between science and spirituality. Prepare to be uplifted, transformed, and awakened to create a path to healing your own life physically, emotionally, and spiritually by bridging the gap between science and soul. Welcome to Dr. Lottie's Science with Soul. Today's guest is William Morris, PhD, DAOM, RH, who has earned 2 doctorates, one in Chinese medicine and the other in transformative inquiry. He has developed 3 doctoral programs in Chinese medicine and 3 institutional review boards for human subjects research. He led institutions to regional accreditation and has served as a consultant to develop program standards for certification. William has 43 years of experience combining historical astrological medical methods in clinical practice. He has 2 books published with China's most prominent medical publishing house. He has other books related to diagnostics, particularly in the field of using astrology as a tool for understanding the human being. His forthcoming book, Sky and Meridian, explores various techniques of using the sky as part of the field of signs and symptoms of clinical practice. In this case, that is relevant to the Meridian system of Chinese medicine. To learn more about William, please visit medastro.com. Welcome, William. It's such an honor to have you as a guest today.
Thank you, Dr. Lottie. It's quite a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you.
So I can't wait. I've been waiting to interview you. It's so fascinating, the field that you're working in. And I want you to start by talking a little bit about how you ended up there. So I understand that your work is at the intersection of healing, sound, and astrology. So can you explain how this area of study was developed and what led you to this area of study?
Yeah, it's okay. So just as a starting piece, this is a transdisciplinary endeavor, which was what my PhD work was in, transdisciplinary work. So we're looking at the intersectionalities. And so I was on the road playing music at the age of 19, 21, right in there, 22. And I got exposed to astrology and did my first consultations then. And I met a medical astrologer, and she said, well, if you're going to do medical astrology, you have to study medicine, right? Because that's that fundamental intersection there is medicine and astrology, and we can look at the historical principles behind that inquiry. But that experience led me to pursue work in the field, and I fortunately chose a humerally based form of medicine, hot, cold, moist, dry, which is pre-modern. Greek, Persia, India, China, all are using this kind of what's called a humoral model, and that got dumped in the Enlightenment. And then we proceeded towards a mechanistic model, neither of which is preferable over the other. It's just that I happened to choose that which was most coherent with the astrological question. And so when I would be teaching, say, East-West medical history in master degree programs for Chinese medicine, I would take in particular, the peak of it, the medieval period and the Renaissance period in the West had the height of medical astrological practices. And they were in the universities. There was a very commonness to it in the question of medicine. And so I would teach those techniques and demonstrate them as part of the inquiry into East-West medical history. Well, what I've discovered recently is that the differences between Greece, China, Persia, and India back then, let's say 2,000 years ago, all humerally centric medicine, were far more common to each other than those medicines are to our conventional medical practices of contemporary period. And so for me, it's been primarily an inquiry into that. I ended up in private practice, was very successful, and decided to get involved in academic medicine, and went to USC and got a master's degree in medical education and put together doctoral programs for three different doctoral programs in Chinese medicine, and put together institutional review boards coherent with those doctoral programs in order to have appropriate discipline relative to ethics in research practices for those learners. The whole time I'm still doing my Chinese medical practice, I'm teaching and I'm doing astrology. And what I would do is, back in the 90s, I'd run a computer in the back room and we do what's called hore, which is the way the sky is at the moment. And I would keep track of that when I would go see the patient, so I could make predictions on what was taking place with that client based on those observations. So that was about a 7-year period of about 45 patients a week doing that method. So it was a tremendous experience. And it convinced me that I actually could do a better job with that knowledge than I could do without it. Mm-hmm. And so that intersectionality led me to the choice of a PhD program, which dealt with that specifically. And so I became more and more conscious of those styles of practice, of opening doors, looking for what are called isomorphisms. These are, that's a technical term for common features. Okay, so let's say all medicines, no matter when, where, have these three features in common: a location, a process, and severity. That's an isomorphism, goes across all cultures, all time periods, for all practices. And so that's a particular interest for me, and it becomes intrinsic to the work. How do we locate where they empower each other? And so that's a big piece of the conversation. And now, because my practice, upon moving to the north here in Canada, to a very, very isolated place, there's 800 people between 3 towns, and it is a medical outback here. But most of my practice is done online, and since about 2018, and it feels good to do it that way for me. And so in that context, I use the astrological chart as part of the field of signs, inclusive of, well, whatever other things we might observe. The tongue, the upper and lower surfaces of the tongue, the inside of the lower eyelids become part of what's feasible in a telemedical consultation for purposes of herbs and homeopathy and sound healing and such. But I still do all of these things, and we work here doing sound healing events where we use the frequencies of the planetary orbits, if you will, in a post-Kepler worldview. Take the average orbital speed of a planet, multiply it by 2s until it becomes a frequency you can hear and feel. And these get selected based on the configurations, geometric configurations in the sky at the moment of a sound healing journey. We select those frequencies, and we have gongs and chimes and all these things that are tuned to those frequencies. Those become the theme, and then I have synthesizers that are tuned to those. So it's been a long road. I'll be 70 this next year, and it's really starting to come together finally, because if you're trying to work several disciplines, becoming highly competent in any one of them is enough on its own. So that requires musical, astrological, subset of medical, which would be Chinese medicine, herbs, homeopathy. So those are the several of the competencies that require maintenance and continued development of knowledge, but they feed each other, and it's a beautiful trip.
So when people work with you online, if there are people listening and they think, "Wow, I want to schedule a session with this guy," um, how, what are the typical things that you would look at? You mentioned the tongue and the eyelids like on the screen, but then you're also looking, I'm assuming, in their astrological chart to see what cycles those planets are in, or how does that affect everything? I mean, how does that affect your decision of what to do? Are there
Yeah,
certain planets that are kind of tend to create issues for people, or is it just individually for that person's chart?
any planet could create an issue, and in a humoral model, for instance, Mars is considered to be a hot, dry planet, and Sun's also hot and dry.
Mhm.
So if we use the concept of opposites or antipathies, they're called. Um, let's say they controlled the sixth house of a disease process. The sky is divided in 12 sections,
Mhm.
and it is the number 12 has intrinsic value 3 by 4 that looks at how things start or maintain and end, or how they go through phases like the seasons. So we have essentially 4 seasons by 3 modes within each of those seasons. I start the season, action. I get into the season, it's stable. And then towards the end of the season, it starts to dissolve and becomes unstable, going to the next season. So that's a very seasonal centric perspective.
Mhm.
But there's also the perspective of the sky. And this concept is called eco-psychosocial. I have an ecosystem at the interior, I have
Mhm.
an ecosystem at the exterior, and they're both in communication and part of my experience.
Mhm.
That exterior uh, ecosystem is inclusive of meteorology. And in meteorology, the we'll get back to your question in a second.
Mhm.
In meteorology, the way Aristotle wrote about meteorology was actual meteors and cosmological phenomena, not just weather-based phenomena as we know it to be today. But they all have a resonance with the human being's experience here on this planet, as we can see with the moon and the tides, and reproductive system function and cardiovascular, lots of research on cardiovascular, psychic, and so forth. So the moon has a great deal of relationship to all of that. So the question is, well, what I look at the chart in order to understand what's going on. Let's say that the eastern horizon in most cultures, that's called a rising sign. Most cultures are going to give that to the fundamental vitality and strength of the constitution. So it's different aspects of self that we can evaluate here. So they describe the planets have coherence with uh, functions in our body.
Mhm.
In other words, location, which would be the signs or the houses or the location where the planets are going to be. And the planets could be classified as having coherence with physiology and or pathophysiology. So on a humoral level, the sun and Mars are hot and dry, whereas Saturn's cold and dry.
Mhm.
So we use warming oils, moistening oils when Saturn's too heavily affecting the physiological expression. So we look at the tongue and we see, oh, it's very dry, and we can see, oh, there's obstructions. There's the veins under the tongue are all congested and full. We see that, oh, Saturn's contributing to that. And then so we use, warming and moistening strategy.
Mhm.
On a simple level, when it goes to homeopathy, that deck of cards gets flipped because we're using similitudes there.
Mhm.
So it's concepts of dose response curves and so forth
Mhm.
relative to care. So essentially, it's not that you say this is that, but rather, oh, there's a coherence. I see the coherence between your history, your family history, the signs that you're presenting here, and the chart. And now we can begin to look at how that might be used. So let's say a person's born with a part of the sky that's all congested with a lot of planets. So on a daily basis, that's an area where there's congestion and stagnation. Annual basis, every time the cycle happens, all the different cycles, 7-year cycles, right? 2.5-year cycles, Mars, Jupiter's at 12.
Mhm.
Chinese are big on this, the Jupiter Saturn cycles. When they finally come back together at the same time. Jupiter will do 5 in 60 years. Saturn will do twice in 60 years. When they come back around, boom, these are cyclical coherences for which conventional medical research supports. Specifically, of particular interest would be, right, the daily diurnal motions and that kind of research. Monthly motions, annual motions, okay, that's obvious. We can see it. I experience spring allergies every time at this time of year. There's our annual thing, but it goes beyond that. So those cycles can be used as part of an understanding of whole life. So plants begin their cycle, seeds sprout. This is at the bottom of the cycle, and then the plant starts to grow, and then leaves and twigs and so forth comes up to the top, and then there's a blossoming and flowering and fruits and seeds, and the barks, the xylem of phloem, the blood vessels of the trees and so forth coming down over the horizon. So there's a whole view, which was the composition of my book called Cycles in Medical Astrology, and that concept. So
yeah, that's really fascinating. So are there people that, if you're born and have planets in a certain place when you're born, does that make you more likely to have more diseases in your life than somebody who has planets in a different spot?
Yeah, there are configurations that can lead one to have a life which is composed of that particular form of suffering. Yeah. The real question is, okay, those planets are there, they're consistent with that, but in this case, for this person, is that so? So it becomes an inquiry-driven process rather than one of some a priori knowledge based on some assumptions. So it's a path of inquiry for me.
And astrology often symbolizes low critical thought and a lack of scientific discretion. Please speak to these ideas, given your own experience in the study of science.
Well, okay, so yeah, I have studied science, and I take probably a different interpretation of what science is than a lot of folks. In other words, early what's called prototypical science of, say, the Han Dynasty in China 2,000 years ago, and early Greece, the Hellenistic period. They're all engaged in scientific inquiry. So the roots of our Western scientific world, of course, Aristotle, and for medicine it was Galen, and these thinkers. What it's come to be is a belief in large population impacts. If we can prove a large population impact, that's a scientific conclusion of some sort, and that's actually an error. Science is really just a process of inquiry. So if we look at astrology scientifically, so you see no practice is scientific unto itself. We can investigate a practice scientifically, and that's a different conversation. So I'm not going to say that, well, certain practices have more concrete, measurable bases to them. Let's say engineering, mechanical engineering, and so forth. And so once we get into the realm of the qualitative experience, so let's look at the comparison actually between, say, astronomy and astrology. So astronomy is a scientific discipline. In other words, it's a discipline that uses science for the purposes of inquiry. And what is that inquiry? It is cataloging, identifying objects in space, cataloging them, measuring them, quantifying all the various factors that go into the question. Whereas astrology is the human practice of assigning meaning. Now that a practice of assigning meaning is qualitative versus the quantitative. So hence another book which I'm working on, which is it's called In Search of the Salient Subjective, which is facing the question of at what point in this whole conversation did we come to the place where objectivity was the basis of truth, and that objectivity goes into power dynamics in clinical relationships, whereby on our records we do what are called SOAP notes, subjective objective assessment plan, right? Well, who's so the patient's experience is classified as subjective. Well, that's lower order in truth propositions than objective that the physician's holding, right?
Yeah.
So now we have this intrinsic power dynamic taking place in the clinical relationship that that everyone's ready to sign on to. Chinese medicine schools, homeopathic schools, conventional schools, doesn't make any difference. They're all doing it.
Yep.
with very little critical eye placed upon the problem, which is one of imperialism and power dynamics. So I think I'm getting a little off track here.
No, I hear what you're saying. I mean, it is kind of backwards, right? Because the more you listen to a patient, the more you're going to know what's going on. Because the patient, I'm going to say, knows intuitively what it is that's wrong, but then the clinicians come in and try to fit it into a box or a code that sort of matches their symptoms, and that is not always correct. And that's why so many people fall through the cracks all the time, because the doctor or the nurse or the practitioner always knows best. They're the ones that went to school, right? But the truth is that the patient themselves are the ones that they're the ones that are experiencing their symptoms. So, and it doesn't always match what the knowledge that the practitioner holds.
Right. So the problem, I mean, in larger culture, oftentimes astrology is used as a way of characterizing with disdain that which is the least scientific and the least rigorous of critical thought. But if we truly look at it, we can say, we walk into a party and say, oh, I don't believe in astrology. Well, my question to that is, well, what does belief have to do with it? For me, this is an outcomes proposition. If I can get better outcomes using the astrological inquiry as part of the equation for management, then I've got something that I am willing to ride and debate and take it into various forms. I think we're going to see a reemergence of this once we have adequate critical inquiry on both sides of the fence. Because typically what happens is anyone who actually approaches the astrological question with a scientific eye, with a rigorous critical thought, will actually start to come around. Here's another example. Besides the typicals of the sun, moon, and earth, the day, month, and year, 18.6 year bloom of marsh mosquitoes in Massachusetts matches precisely the 18.6 year eclipse cycle. Now, the eclipse cycle was used in India, but also in early Europe as a way of timing epidemics. So if you tie mosquito blooms with potential mosquito vector born diseases that are either known or not known, and it becomes a strange coherence. It's right. It's so we can't play into that equation of dismissal, which is it's about proof relative to coincidence. Coincidence should spark inquiry. It's not the answer. But coincidence is part of coherence, and coherence in the field of phenomenon are what indigenous medical practitioners were looking at, in the totality of the experience shared between the practitioner and the person seeking help.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Everything is interconnected. So, and it's like we've
Yeah,
lost our
nice.
way, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Modern science. Modern science are great. Like if you have a heart attack, you're in a car accident, I'm going to the ER, right? But
Sure.
a lot of the rest of the stuff that's not an acute issue, that's more chronic, or I'm going to say that the Western medical system often fails in that. All they can do is suppress the symptoms with a pharmaceutical, but they can't really often get to the root cause or really understand what's going on or how to make that better.
Right. And
Yeah.
one of the more interesting things I think that's possible with an astrological inquiry is the more in-depth uh, discovery of transgenerational imprints, either trauma based or enlightenment based, whatever they might be. How transgenerational phenomenon takes place through the bloodline. There's a few ways that we have to look at that. Super in-depth styles of Chinese pulse diagnosis, not the way it's taught in schools, but the way I was taught in my family lineage, provides capacity to gaze into the bloodline at depth, but also the astrological question provides that, along with, of course, those cultures who see that as a significant and important thing, which I think is happening more in the common in the common literature. We're seeing it more and more.
Mhm. So when you talk about transgenerational bloodline and pulse diagnosis, what is it that you see? Is it like the disease itself? They
Well, yeah, um, it's partly here we start to engage in with an intersection between what's called narrative medicine, which is how the story unfolds. And there are people in the Boston area who specialized, of course, in this back in the 90s and
That's
80s.
almost when I went to school there. I went to school in Boston in the 1980s,
Oh, well, then
early 1980s.
you might have come
Boston
across them.
University, graduated in 1983.
Oh, nice. Yes, nice, nice. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So, um, the narrative. So, as a person unfolds a narrative, the pulse will mirror that narrative in its nuances. If that narrative is targeted into the family business
Mhm.
of stuff that went on, right?
Mhm.
They start talking about their great grandfather and their experience here and there and everywhere. Feeling the pulse while that's taking place gives you a direct connection at a physiological level to that experience, and the signals that come through can be used to construct herbal formulas that are coherent with that experience and begin to transform it and shapeshift it. And where you can see it as evidence is when issues in the current family system start to transform as this person's uh, doing certain types of work, not just herbal medicine or homeopathy, but maybe different kinds of mantras can have a tremendous impact on awakening healing processes and for generations back and forward.
So are you saying that when one person gets sick and you work with this person, you do the pulse diagnosis, and that person then starts taking herbs and they're doing mantras and they're doing all these different things to create healing? Are you saying that the people in their family system are also sort of creating healing, even though they're not working on it directly because they're like interconnected?
Yeah, it's not so much a remedial concept, not because they got sick, because usually if they're sick, we're working on that sickness. But if that sickness is tied in, let's say uh, 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 endometriosis, and every woman in the matrilineal bloodlines had endometriosis, then yeah, there's a connection, and there's some going to be resonances in that. But let's say in a wellness model, they're okay, but they've identified things that they're concerned about in their whole experience and what they carry on this planet with respect to their bloodlines and their spiritual life.
Mm-hmm.
And as those conversations come forward, then the treatments get constructed around that, and that is more specifically linked to that material, and it could be observed.
Mm-hmm. So, like if you saw, for example, somebody who had endometriosis, now that tends to run in families. But you're saying it's not, is it just, are you only talking about like it's inherited on the DNA, or there is some other component that's part of the astrological charts of those? Let's say you have a let's say you have a young woman, she has endometriosis. She says, you know what? My mom also had it. And I think her mom also had it, right?
Yeah.
Now, is that not just related to the DNA or the way the tissue was laid down and there is like some genetic component to it, but there's also something tied in astrologically to why it's being repeated, or is it more just the bloodline and DNA?
Right. Well, I mean, we haven't had DNA around that long, you know,
Truth.
as an awareness. But the cultures have been engaged in healing familial pathologies for millennia upon millennia. We have early Vedic rituals, fire rituals for transforming. They call the pit trees, pit tree doshas. This is particularly the father's bloodline. But there's in the astrological chart, there's ways to see those patterns that are taking place along the matrilineal bloodline. Those patterns are taking place in the patrilineal bloodline. Now, is that DNA? No, well, no, it's an astrological conversation, and sometimes people will connect them as a metaphorically. That's kind of like they could be, people do that. I think that DNA is a feature. It's a feature, we can see it, we can measure it, right? Yeah. I think there's more beyond that to the human experience and to the unfolding of karmas that each of us as a soul on this planet have obligations to entertain and resolve. And so having said that, the evidence in one of those scenarios would be this: that young lady who had the questions about that, who managed to have kids, right? And her daughter didn't have it. And her daughter's daughter didn't have it. That would be a signal about some resolution at the level of the bloodline. Now, would that show up genetically? I don't know. This genetic pattern might still be there, such that it could be the sleeping giant could be awakened. But so there's, I don't think you can talk about DNA without talking about karma, or for the Greeks, destiny. And so how we as individuals engage our free will with that of destiny is something that's wrestled with in most cultures.
So would you say there can be like a karmic component to why somebody, let's say, is sick for 6 years, and do you see that that could be like like karma they're paying off, or like a past life or something like that when you look in those people's charts?
Well, yeah, it could be karma. Let's say it's a karma of McDonald's. 20 years of not McDonald's, and now they're wrestling with congestive heart failure, and so that's an immediate karma. based on immediate actions. Without getting into people's beliefs and so forth, you know, it is the things that we do every day that create most of our chronic health problems that we either we do or we don't do. And so having insight into that assumption, which is not true for everyone, but often true and worth exploring. So, so that would be an immediate and what's called a movable karma. Now, the person comes in with some genetic patternings for a disease process, and their sibling, then they have the same gene setup, and sibling has the problem and they don't. But the sibling went through a series of, you know, move, job change, divorce, lost the kids, and now they're in it hard. And so what brought that about, and how do we engage with life in such a way that we're able to fulfill our goals here?
Right, the incarnation itself.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I see that when I work with my clients too. There's always so many different components, and people would like me to say, just change your diet and everything's going to be great. But there's always so many different components that have to be looked at. Like you said, what is your environment like? You know,
Right.
what are your emotions like? Where did you come from? What was your childhood experiences? What are you,
Yep.
you know, exposed to environmentally? Do you live next to a factory? What water are you drinking? What do your genes look like? And, you know, it goes on and on and on. There's so many components. And then we got the astrological chart. Are we paying off some past life karma? Did we incarnate to have this experience? There must be, right? But there must
Well,
be when you're looking at all these different things, when you get a new patient, how do you figure out like what to do with someone? Let's say somebody gets
I
on
asked them,
the screen,
I asked them, what do you want? What do you want to work on?
right? Because there's
And they
so
go,
many
well, you're an
components.
astrologer. I thought I'd just let you tell me. And I go, well, it, I can take, uh, I can point in different directions. That's me just pointing in different directions. Let's look at that. Let's look at that. Uh, yeah. Um, it is an inquiry driven process for me.
Yeah. What about like, so in homeopathy, when I studied homeopathy, because I'm a naturopathic physician, they said, well, you know, you can fix a lot of things, but there are times people are born with something. There's, you know, they're born with
The miasm thing.
defective heart, or, you know, you can't really fix that with homeopathy. How do you look at the people that are born with certain things they're born with a tumor, they're born with um, a malformation in their brain or heart or blood vessel somewhere. How do you look at that? Can you see that in somebody's chart that they were supposed to be born this way and now they got this, you know, journey of trying to figure out how to fix it and get better and have surgery and whatever it is?
Yeah. Yes, it can be seen. There's particularly in the Indian astrological approach. Western Western astrology, of course, is coming up in a Christianized world, and so therefore the notions of reincarnation were taken out during the Council of Nicaea. So it's not part of the literate basis of the traditions. And in order to survive, you have to toe certain party lines, if you will, relative to what astrology does and all this kind of stuff. Whereas in India, it was very, very different.
Mhm.
And so there are specific charts that are calculated based on what are called harmonics or what are called divisional charts. There's charts that are used to specifically look at the mother or the father bloodlines, siblings. There are charts that are specific to prior lifetimes, specifically the immediate prior lifetime, the lifetime prior to that, charts that are specific to the types of karmas that are unfolding in this lifetime. and those
Fascinating.
they will come from the root chart
uh,
called the radix in
mhm.
Western tradition. Yeah.
So when you get a new client, you start by asking them all the different symptoms and all the different things that's going on. But then when you look in their chart, are there times when you then also have to go look at, well, let me look at your mom's chart or let me look at your dad's chart to kind of get a more complete picture?
Yeah, especially when that comes up, it's like,
Hmm.
uh, uh, got, I've got a kid with these problems, and
Hmm.
so that's going to show up as the karmic pattern for the parent in the chart for children, which is what's called a seventh divisional chart.
Oh, that's so fascinating. Just amazing. I mean, because we're so much more entangled with the planets and the things that we don't, us normal people don't have knowledge of unless you study it and you become somebody like yourself, right? We have no knowledge of how to look at that and how to incorporate that. I wish that was more, there would be more training like that in med school, even if it was just at least give us some kind of an idea that, oh yeah, all these other parts are there and you can learn more about it when you get out. But it's so divided. It's like science is science, and this is what you're going to learn, and this is how you're
Right.
going to treat it. And
Right.
it's always a pharmaceutical. It's never anything else, right?
Yeah, and the seven liberal arts, of course, uh, mathematicos. You see, mathematicos is inclusive of the discipline of astrology. You had to have mathematical skills because now we have computers that do it all, and I do much better in this time than before I had a computer. I could do them by hand. I would calculate the charts by hand, but it's not something I enjoy doing, or what I or like taking time to do. And but for those reasons, as a culture, we're losing the skill to
Hmm.
hand calculate charts and so forth. Mhm. But it's the world of science and separation is a fairly new
Hmm.
concept.
Yeah. We used to be smarter, I think, in some ways.
So,
But
yeah,
hopefully I are going
it's
back to
various.
it. Uh,
Well,
the Newtonian approach, right?
my mentor, Leon Hammer, who's a psychiatrist practicing Chinese medicine, and Leon would just passed this last year at the age of 98, 99.
Wow.
And he would say, there's no evidence that what we're doing now worked better than what we had then. Maybe the lifespan's a little different, but there's really very little evidence that 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 earlier traditions weren't really useful and effective
Mhm.
in many ways. So
Yeah, well, they've been around for thousands of years, and our new medicine is very young.
yeah,
So, do you have any current projects that you're working on?
I do. I teach over at Kepler College, and I work with my mentor, who's a Rutgers trained botanist turned medical astrologer, and we have a program that we're involved with over there, certification in medical astrology. And so I have coursework that I run, a case study group, and different physicians of different traditions will come together and look at the astrological chart and share their information on the problems. And it's works out. So from medical docs to naturopaths to acupuncture, Chinese medicine, herbalists, and so forth.
Mhm.
But homeopaths. But right now I have a book called Sky and Meridian, which is in development, and that's the use of sky-based concepts for meridians. And because the 12 meridians of acupuncture are the same as the dividing the sky into 12 houses or 12 signs, which is a mathematical abstraction of the sky. It has nothing to do with like Ophiuchus and there's
Yeah.
13 that's not the
Yeah.
thing. It is the 12-fold division gives you
Mhm.
a mathematical approach to organizing knowledge about the universe. And
Mhm.
that's its virtue. And so 13 does not provide that virtue in any way, shape,
Mhm.
or form. But um, so the sky and meridian is, and also one called sky and earth, which is using herbs in the conjunction with sky-based assessments. And there's a few other projects that are off in the distance, but those are on the near term, within the next year or two, probably sooner next year. The Sky and Meridian, I suspect.
Can't wait.
Artwork,
yeah.
Artwork's done. Artwork's done. A lot of the writing's done. Yeah.
All right. And if I know we're almost out of time, so if I was going to ask you the last question, I'm going to ask you, what do you think is the meaning of life?
What do I think is the meaning of life? Well, the thing that comes to my mind, which is not what I would have thought I would answer, is life is its own longing for itself. But for each of us has a different meaning of life. But I think ultimately it's an evolutionary spiritual moment that we're engaged with here, and that we've all agreed to be here at this time. There's a significance about this, which is very large, and it's a process of exploration and understanding and awakening.
Mm-hmm. And how can people learn more about you or schedule a session like online and work with you?
Sure, they can contact me. I'm pretty available. Just search on my name and it'll come up. Just add degrees or Chinese medicine or herbs or these things, astrology. All those things are going to get you there. But I have a website that I use as the focal point for this current project on medical astrology, which is medastro.com. It's medastro.com. And I think that's probably the most efficient way to get a hold of me.
All right. So we'll make sure to put that link in the podcast notes as well. So it's medastro.com, and you can just click on that and go learn more about William on his website. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time and sharing all this fascinating information with the listeners.
Thanks, Dr. Lottie. What a great interview. Appreciate you reaching out and taking time. Greatly appreciate it.
As we conclude this episode, I want to express my heartfelt gratitude for your presence within my community. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe, comment, like, and share this podcast episode. Join my free newsletter in the show notes and receive new podcast episodes delivered right to your inbox. If you resonate with the interconnectedness of mind, body, and soul, and are motivated to embark on a journey of personal healing, I invite you to connect with me at drlottie.com. Together, we can pave a path towards transformative healing in your own life.